Seeing things, that's what we're talking about today. Seeing things. Sometimes we say, you're just seeing things, and it's not exactly a compliment. But for the most part, that's not what we're talking about today. The notion that we are seeing things that aren't really there, that's for the most part not what we're talking about, although that reading from Jeremiah, which must have sounded really odd to you, since it just sort of came with no context. Jeremiah in that reading actually was inviting us to see something that really wasn't there at the moment, but Jeremiah believed it would be there. You remember, since we've been reading the prophet Jeremiah, early on when we read about the call of Jeremiah into his prophetic role, he was called to tear down and destroy and sort of clear the decks before he began to announce the building up and the planting and the renewing. And for several Sundays now, as we have heard from the prophet Jeremiah, it's been the tearing down and the destroying and the ripping apart. And now the nation is well into that course. You heard in the reading that Jeremiah was in jail because the king got tired of listening to all of his prophecies of doom. Maybe if I put him in jail, I'll shut him up. But the army has come around. The Babylonian army has come around to lay siege to the city. So the end is at hand. Things are coming. The destruction is happening just as Jeremiah said it would. And in this really odd text, Jeremiah invited us to see that this destruction wasn't the end. The bottom is dropping out of everything as Jeremiah does what he does in that text. The real estate market is falling apart. Everything is falling apart. And that's when Jeremiah decides it's time to get into the real estate market. Time to buy a field. Even though there is no reason to believe that the economy is going to recover during Jeremiah's lifetime, Jeremiah goes ahead and buys the field anyway. A field he will never till. A field he will never harvest. A field none of his descendants will be able to till or harvest for at least 70 years, maybe longer, until the end of the Babylonian captivity. Nobody can make sense out of what Jeremiah did. Nobody can see any sense in it. But Jeremiah, who is somehow able to see beyond the present calamity into a future that God will still create for God's people, eventually. So Jeremiah dares to believe God's promise, despite the fact that there is not one shred of visible evidence pointing to even a vague possibility that it might come true. Now, was Jeremiah seeing things? Was Jeremiah seeing things maybe in the worst sense of the word, or maybe in the best sense of the word? Seeing things. As maybe really seeing things. Seeing what is right there, right in front of our faces, if we are paying attention. Seeing things. The kind of seeing that eventually goes beyond what our eyes are able to see. The kind of sight that turns into insight. There's a reason why the language works the way it does. Works into insight, or the kind of seeing that eventually works into understanding. The kind of seeing which eventually becomes a vision. One of the reasons for that hymn that we just sang is that it, in various kinds of symbolic ways, invites us to see beyond what is right there in front of us, knowing what is possible as these various images work themselves out. A kind of seeing that grows into vision. Maybe vision is what we're talking about today. Maybe we're talking about seeing what really is there, or what ought to be there. Seeing how to get from here to there. Vision, the kind of seeing that creates faith. Vision, the kind of seeing that creates hope. The kind of seeing that creates change. Vision that enables us to change our attitudes. Vision that enables us to change our behavior. And that's where that story that Jesus told fits in. That story, a parable, and it didn't literally really happen, but it's a story that Jesus told to convey a certain sense of what life was all about. A story about the rich man and Lazarus. The thing to see about the rich man in the story is that he was just being a rich man. He wore his nice clothes, and he ate his good food, and he stayed on his side of the gate, and when he left his house, no doubt he climbed into a limousine, and the chauffeur had to tend with whatever else was out there in the real world. He was in his limousine. So the rich man probably never even saw the poor man who was lying right outside his gate, who was hungry and wanted to eat the table scraps that the dogs got to eat. The very same dogs who came and licked his sores, which maybe was about the only consolation he got. There's no malice here. There's no evil intent here. There's no kicking this man while he's down. There's no scolding and finger pointing and insulting. He's not standing there telling the guy, if he'd go get a job, it wouldn't be like this. None of that. Absolutely none of that at all. There is nothing. There's not seeing what perhaps he could have tripped over with his feet, not noticing what literally was right there under his nose. And I said, what? Intentionally. Not seeing what was literally under his feet, not seeing what perhaps he could have tripped over. I said, what? Intentionally. In the eye of the rich man, there was no who at his gate. There was no person there to care about. And oddly enough, that didn't change when the scene changed. As Jesus told the story, Lazarus died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man died and was buried. That's the way Jesus said it. Rather interesting contrast, isn't it? The poor man died and was carried into the bosom of Abraham, and the rich man died and he was buried. And in Hades, where he was being tormented, the rich man could see Abraham way over there, a long ways away, and Lazarus was over there with him, by Abraham's side. And the rich man felt the pain of his torment, and he felt as though he was entitled to some kind of consolation, some kind of comfort. So, send Lazarus! Send Lazarus! As though Lazarus were some kind of a messenger boy who could be ordered around, which of course is how it is in a household where there are slaves. They aren't people really, they're just work doers. Maybe if Abraham would turn Lazarus into some sort of a whiz-bang kid, having come back from the dead, for example, maybe the brothers who remain still on earth would have their eyes open. But it's too late for the rich man. What he sees now even does not help him. And he still does not see Lazarus as a human being like himself, someone who deserves what human beings deserve from other human beings. Any insight in that story? Anything that opens your eyes? The words about caring for the poor, the words about caring for the orphans and the widows, the words about caring for the sick, the words about caring for the aliens, they're splattered all over the place in that biblical text we all hold so dear. Do we see the words? Do we heed the words? Heed as in actually do them? Church in Washington, D.C. I was reading about this week. The church, as is often the case in inner city churches, this church hosted a homeless shelter for people who didn't have any place to stay. And in this homeless shelter, as they got to know some of the people, they invited some of the people who were staying in the homeless shelter to tell some of their stories to members of the congregation. So they set up a particular night where this could happen. And somebody from the congregation asked one of these homeless people, "What should I do when one of you asks for money?" And the response intrigues me. It plays right into this story. Listen to the response. The homeless man said to the person who asked the question, "Follow your gut about giving the money. Do what your gut tells you to do. Say yes or say no as you will. But treat me like a person when you say it, whatever you say. Look me in the eye, shake my hand, say you're sorry. Somehow let me know that you see me. Somehow let me know that you see me. Because we spend our every day being unseen. Don't act like we aren't there." I read that little story, and I remember for a stretch, I was rather often going up to Midway Airport, so you go up I-55 and you come down that exit ramp that you turn onto the Cicero, where you go down to Midway Airport. Every single time you come off that ramp, who's down at the stop sign? Remember? There's a whole bunch of people with their cans out looking for money, and I come down that stop sign and I drive right through it just like that, because I'm nervous, because I'm afraid, because I don't want nothing to roll down my window. You know what I'm talking about. It's the kind of thing that does sort of open your eyes. Before this is a story about poverty, before this is a story about wealth, before this is a story about allocating resources, before it's a story about doing the right thing, whatever that is, before it's a story about doing the Christian thing, whatever that is, it's a story about seeing. It's a story about vision. And I know we're all busy. I know our resources are stretched. And I just even confess that sometimes I'm afraid in those settings, and maybe you are too. But without a vision, without some kind of an eye-opening moment, nothing's going to change. Nothing is going to change. And in the story Jesus told, that's how somebody wound up on the wrong side of the great divide. And so Jesus tells this story, first of all, to open our eyes. Maybe even especially to open the eyes of our hearts. Open the eyes of our hearts so that we become ready to hear what preacher Paul told preacher Timothy to tell to preacher Timothy's congregation. You remember that Paul is training Timothy. This is kind of an internship, and Timothy is already working as a pastor of a church in Ephesus. Paul is training him, helping him understand what he needs to say to that congregation that he's pastor of. You remember what we heard in the text. Do not set your hope on the uncertainty of riches. Rather, set your hope on God, who richly provides us everything for our enjoyment. And then he goes on to say, do good, be rich in good works, be generous, be ready to share, because this is the life that really is life. Now, in the story Jesus told, the rich man did finally express some concern for his brothers who were headed down the same road. Maybe if somebody came back from the dead, he says, maybe if somebody came back from the dead, that would get their attention, that would shake them up, that would make them see. And Abraham said, no, they already have the words from Moses, they already have the words from the prophets, that's plenty enough. And Abraham did tell the truth, you know it, and so do I. But there is this little wrinkle. You and I come into the story as maybe not one of the 5 siblings, but maybe as one of the cousins to the rich man who died. Maybe one of the less well-off cousins, but somehow sort of a cousin to the man who died, close enough to belong to the story. But for us, there is this one new piece. For us, somebody did rise from the dead. For us, somebody did come back from the other side. Somebody whose resurrection validated every word he spoke. Somebody whose resurrection validated every lesson he taught. Somebody whose resurrection validated every promise he made. And by the power of that resurrection, he heals blind eyes and he heals blind hearts. By the power of the life that really is life, he transforms us into the people we are called to be. Do you see it? Do you see him? Do you see what he calls you to become? Do you see needs that you need to address? Do you see hopes that you need to embrace? Do you see changes you need to make? One last thing. I saw a Twitter post this week commenting on today's text. One of the fascinating and frustrating things about Twitter, any of you do Twitter? I don't much, but Twitter plays by a very tight rule. 140 characters. That's it. Character 141 disappears. You do 140, you can say whatever you want in 140 characters. So it forces a certain kind of preciseness or pithiness. This tweet was posted concerning today's text. Once I was blind, now I have really bad vision. Once I was blind, now I have really bad vision. Maybe so. But even so, we're headed in the right direction. Keep looking. Keep praying. Keep seeing. Let us pray. Risen Christ, may your healing power replace our blindness with breathing